Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing well. Bitcoin continues to do its thing, and that's always exciting. We're working through the mempool crash course last week. Last week, we took a slight diversion by kind of diving further into the speculative attack and its implications 10 years onward with Speculative Attack Season 2. But we're now back in the crash course itself. And now that we've gotten through all that, the question has now come to one of control and attacks on Bitcoin and how Bitcoin works with that. So in the crash course, it says, within the system, the protocol rules are bound by the investors. Attacks on the system are possible, but they require entrepreneurship, which takes time. Meanwhile, Bitcoin's growth creates agency problems in coordinated attacks by instead incentivizing defection. And we'll get to those final statements today. We're interested in how investors kind of what role different actors in Bitcoin play in changes to Bitcoin insofar as they do or do not happen. And you could actually look at that in both ways. It's like people who if they have control, they're able to make things happen, but they're also able to keep things from happening too. So in a decentralized system like Bitcoin, which presumably works, hopefully works, I think it works. We'll talk about that. How does this process actually happen? And the article we're looking at today about that is this one from 2015. It's called Who Controls Bitcoin by Daniel Krawisz. It was published on February 8th, 2015. The price was about $224. And yeah, so this one's about, in the context of forks, who actually is deciding kind of the protocol rules. And I think this is a bit of a contentious article, and I think there's even going to be some things that we're going to want to maybe correct, but also just clarify in general. And one of the things I wanted to talk about before reading the article was that this article, by having been written in early 2015, was very early with regards to what people now refer to as the block size wars, which kind of, culminated in 2017 with the forking of Bitcoin Cash in August 2017, as well as the activation of SegWit on Bitcoin. And during that story, if people want to go read the block size wars and other materials on the topic, there are things like the New York Agreement and things like that, where different devs and mining companies, miners, and just Bitcoin companies in general were signing on to different changes, and some of those changes kind of fell flat, even with a lot of sort of corporate power and hash power behind it. So I think this article actually kind of helps us understand some of that. But at the same time, because it was early on, there wasn't as much distinction at the time between hard forks and soft forks, and a lot of upgrades to Bitcoin, or perceived upgrades, were assumed to be something that you would hard fork. It was actually a big deal when Luke Dashier figured out how SegWit could be done in a soft fork manner, which would avoid the sort of contentious explicit chain split. So because of that, this article does more heavily focus on hard forks, but perhaps we can, think through how soft forks play into this. And we can also get into the difference between those. The other thing that I wanted to mention is because the way the language is in here, someone today might read it and maybe even get almost thrown off by kind of separating full node operators from, investors and miners and so on. And because, a lot of hardcore Bitcoiners, they run a full node and they're investors. And so, it seems almost weird to separate those, by class. And there are ways in which you can come to false conclusions in this analysis. But I did want to clarify that actual classification, which is, in economics, we have to look at all of human action and try to make sense of it. And different actions have sort of different intents and different sort of purposes. And they can have a lot of things going on in one action. But as a way to work through the analysis of it, we can kind of separate different parts of action into different purposes. So one of the things that you'll see in economics broadly is a distinction between capitalists, entrepreneurs, and consumers. Capitalists own capital, and so they sort of earn profits through basically renting that capital. You have entrepreneurs who are going out and finding new profit opportunities and finding ways to profit off them. And then you have consumers who are acquiring goods in the market. And we kind of treat these as three separate things. But the reality is that capitalists and capitalists are also entrepreneurs and consumers, because they have to, at every step of the way, decide, well, I need to speculate on the future, which is inherently a sort of entrepreneurial act of, well, do I want to keep this capital or sell this capital? And, are there more or less consumer goods that I want in my life? Because no one has a perfectly zero time preference. Likewise, entrepreneurs, they need capital in order to be entrepreneurs. Even if that capital is merely your knowledge, you still need that in order to actually do something in the world. And they also have to eat. And consumers, they have to have had something in order to acquire the goods to consume, which already implies that they were making entrepreneurial decisions and had some kind of capital. Once again, even if it was literally just their body, taking up time foraging berries or something, they still had to act as some sort of capitalist and entrepreneur in order to get to that place of consumption. So, when we look at these classifications, that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to believe that each distinct class is perfectly analyzed in this article, but I did want to give that heads up as a way to understand that we can make these classifications and they can be helpful. We also do need to be careful after the fact to, still be correct in our analysis when we do that. Pierre, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree.
Okay, well, let's hop right in. A common and understandable concern about Bitcoin is that it might become corrupted at the protocol level to serve special interests rather than the unwashed masses. For example, features might become adopted which make Bitcoin much less anonymous or which turn it into a centralized system. This question is really about who can influence the development of updates and who can block them. Anyone can fork Bitcoin, but suppose there were an upgrade proposed by some very influential people, the core devs, and suppose that it would hard fork the Bitcoin protocol in some fundamental and controversial way. The core dev says it's a good idea, but maybe they've been paid off by the NSA. The question I will answer here is whether and how such an upgrade could be prevented from becoming standardized. Who controls Bitcoin? I guess actually, before we even get into this, maybe that is a good time to just explain at a high level the difference between a hard fork and a soft fork. Pierre, would you like to have the honors of making that distinction?
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, it's interesting. The framing in the first paragraph is kind of the reverse of the framing that we've seen recently, where people are worried about upgrades not happening. And so they're worried about ossification. So at a high level, a hard fork is a change to the protocol rules where all of the nodes have to upgrade. They have to run this new software to be compatible with the consensus rules. A soft fork, technically, you don't have to upgrade your node. It will continue to stay on the chain, but you won't be enforcing the full set of rules, and you're at risk if you're receiving funds that use that soft fork feature and you're not verifying it yourself. So I think that it's really about the compatibility of the software. And that might sound like a trivial difference, but it really, I think, is a very substantial difference from a practical perspective, which is that if with Bitcoin, traditionally, there's no automatic upgrade in the software. And so when you're running Windows or Mac OS or even Linux for that matter, you might have automatic patches where they push the update to your computer and you don't really have a say in it. It happens overnight or whatever, and then you wake up and they've changed the software for you. That doesn't exist in Bitcoin, although I heard that Luke Dasher's Knots has that as an optional feature. So that means that if you're trying to do a hard fork, you basically have to get everyone to adopt the new version of the software. Whereas a soft fork, you can get away with not having everybody upgrade. Which means that you have the ability to phase in the update. So if we look at SegWit, for example, so this isn't specifically hard fork versus soft fork, but I also think that there's an important part here, which is that it's optional to use the feature. It's true for a hard fork or a soft fork in theory, but like if we look at the adoption of SegWit as a feature, it took many years for people to start using it. And so that's another interesting characteristic, not super relevant to hard fork versus soft fork. But I also, I think that in Ethereum land, I think it's good to do some comparative analysis. They have been, and Vitalik himself has said that he sees hard forks as less coercive, which that doesn't make sense to me when historically the mechanism back under proof of work to make the hard fork happen was called the difficulty bomb, BOMB, which to me sounds coercive, where they would have it hard coded into the software that the difficulty will arbitrarily increase at some point in the future, forcing a hard fork to happen. And that way they don't have this issue of getting everybody to upgrade because they force everyone to upgrade. So Bitcoin not having that, I think is good because it essentially makes it so that the users have to opt into the new changes rather than having them foisted onto them by the developers. But yeah, that's some thoughts there.
Yeah, I think the backwards incompatibility or compatibility issue in general, I think that really is one of the, in some sense, most underappreciated aspect of the difference, even though it's fundamental to the definition of them. And this is for a number of reasons, including what you described. But there's also so I will say not every soft fork is necessarily good. You can actually do some very malicious things with a bad soft fork, a malicious soft fork. But soft forks aren't inherently bad either, but I would argue that there are inherent properties to a hard fork that should make people be a bit wary. And one of those is, this might be overly strong as a statement, but I'm willing to stand by it until someone points out a strong enough counter, which is I think that a hard fork is a repudiation of proof of work. Because changing that software means that the next block having completely different rule sets that are incompatible is based on knowing which software to run, which is not kind of included in proof of work, going back to the Genesis block. It's not something that you can just independently verify from that. It has to be something that is in some sense, shall we say, social or even, dare I say, political in deciding which piece of software you should run. Whereas because of the fact that when the new block comes, it doesn't matter what proof of work it has. If you don't have the new code, it's not going to be recognized. Whereas with a soft fork, like I said, there is, theoretically, there's all kinds of malicious soft forks. But if one comes, your node can recognize that there has been a continuation of the network just by looking at the proof of work. And you might start to see transactions that seem a little strange, but your existing funds are not, inherently moved over to something, because the backwards compatibility, in a good thing is implying that, the encumbrance of the UTXOs remains as is. Things are more, opt-in. So things can come in that are a little funny, and it's like, well, I don't want to participate in that. And if you're accepting money for a business, maybe you don't ask for money that gets, because you haven't opted in, you're not asking for money that's encumbered in a new transaction type of some kind. And so you just don't participate. But you can still watch the network continue on and have that actual proof of work as a guidance for what the next block is, as opposed to needing to engage with the broader world to get a sense. And I think that's an extremely important idea, because you're effectively creating a new currency then, wholesale. Now, we can get in later. I think that there's ways in which we could imagine hard forks still happening in Bitcoin, and not even in a bad way per se. But I do think soft forks, while they are not inherently good, I think that hard forks are almost inherently bad outside of some extreme edge cases that in some ways prove the rule.
Yeah, I think it has to be existential. But in any case, we can continue and see how the article evolves.
Yes. All right. New and classic. We'll assume that there is some real disagreement about whether the upgrade is a good idea, because if there is not, then there would be no problem. Thus, once the upgrade is released, the network splits. Everyone can choose which fork to follow, or even run both versions at the same time. Effectively, there are two Bitcoins now. I'll call them Bitcoin New and Bitcoin Classic. This should be differentiated from the actual Bitcoin Classic attempt that came out many, many years ago.
Inspired by this, they were like, oh, that's a good name for it.
Yes, this did come out before that. I should have actually looked up the timeline of those kinds of projects that happen. But continuing on, each has its own network, and anyone who owned Bitcoins before has the same amount of new and classic. And this is true of a hard fork, assuming that, everything stays the same. It splits and it keeps the same UTXO set and everything. It just now has a different set of rules. Who can stop new Bitcoin from taking over? This thread on Bitcoin Talk, which unfortunately we don't actually have the link to, argues that the people who run full nodes can stop an upgrade by refusing to upgrade. Well, it is true that if literally no one upgrades, then Bitcoin New fails. However, it is also true that almost nobody's decision to upgrade has any real effect on the network. Most nodes are dead weight. Even the full nodes, by which I mean nodes that store and validate the whole blockchain, are not contributing much. A full node doesn't do anything that lots of other nodes cannot do, and in order to remain synced with the network, they demand as much data as they provide. The network can function just fine with only a few full nodes. Therefore, Bitcoin New won't necessarily be stopped even if a lot of full nodes refuse to upgrade. The nodes that really matter are the ones that provide valuable services. It doesn't matter if you upgrade. What matters is if Coinbase, Bitstamp, and Blockchain.info upgrade. These nodes provide a lot of infrastructure for Bitcoin, so if they do not upgrade, Bitcoin New will be a lot less useful. However, these nodes are in it for profit, so they will tend to go where the money is. They cannot necessarily afford to wield the influence they might have at the risk of short-term losses. Therefore, they do not necessarily have as great an effect on the outcome as it might at first seem. And this is a good time to jump in and talk about what full nodes actually do, because I think this is somewhere where we've also, I think, come to appreciate full nodes much more since the days of 2015. So what do full nodes actually do, Pierre?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I feel like we should delete this article from Nakamoto Institute's website. But the first thing, well, really, I would argue the only thing that they do is be able to, to put it simply, they are Bitcoin, right? So in the sense that if you're on your island, or let's say you're Satoshi Nakamoto in January of 2009, and you open up your node software, and you don't connect to any peers, right? There's just one node on the network. Like, that is Bitcoin. And what it is doing is that it is verifying the transactions that are being proposed by wallets, right? So wallets construct transactions. They broadcast it out to the network of nodes. The nodes verify those transactions to make sure that they're following the protocol rules of Bitcoin. And again, the protocol rules of Bitcoin, that is the definition of what Bitcoin is, right? Bitcoin is a protocol. And so the rules of it are, it's almost like circular tautology. But in any case, after they have verified the transactions, they put them in the mempool. Each node has its own mempool, a backlog of transactions waiting to get into the next block. Some subset of the nodes happen to have a mining pool connected to them that will construct a block template based on what transactions are in that node's mempool. And then they'll mine that block. They'll broadcast the block header out and the block data to the nodes, and the nodes will verify that the block that is being proposed by that miner is valid. Again, checking it against the protocol rules, and that then adding it to the blockchain if it is. So you could say, okay, like Daniel's saying here, it doesn't really matter how many nodes there are. In fact, you could argue that there could just be one node. And what I would disagree with in this paragraph is the idea that one node matters more if it's owned and operated by an economic actor that's processing lots of transactions. I would argue that if you're going to do the reductio ad absurdum of how many nodes do you really need, well, you only need one, and it doesn't have to be an economic node even. It just has to be verifying the rules. And so to try to rank order the importance of nodes by their economic weight, I think is profoundly misleading. One way to look at it would be that, let's say you're an incredibly wealthy person, or you are Brian Armstrong at Coinbase or something, right? And somebody wants to withdraw their Bitcoin or to deposit Bitcoin, they're going to want to make sure that you're following the same protocol rules. And so all of these businesses that have this economic weight, ultimately they're borrowing that economic weight from their customers, right? It's their customers' economic weight that they're aggregating, and that is not a license to do whatever they want. And so that's where, even so in any case, you could take an example of like a wealthy person who hires a gardener, and the gardener is on the Bitcoin protocol. This wealthy person is like, oh, well, my node, I'm going to change the protocol rules and I'm going to be on my own network, but I'm still going to pay for, you to mow my lawn. And the gardener says, well, no, like, you're not sending me a valid transaction here, so I'm not going to mow your lawn. That, it doesn't really matter how much economic weight the wealthy person has. So the gardener will go mow somebody else's lawn. It's not like there's some kind of a way for economic weight to coerce other actors on the network. And I'd argue that we saw it after the publication of this article, right, with the SegWit 2x block size wars in 2017, where You had the New York Agreement. You had all of these people with their economically important nodes try to change the protocol rules unilaterally, in a sense, and fail in that regard. So I also think that we have to even look at it on a more meta level of, okay, it's important to run your own node and to verify your own transactions. But really what's even more important is kind of even in the abstract of, you could potentially run a node, right? It's the freedom of opportunity, the permissionless nature of it. That's really what's valuable. And that you could say, well, look, he's not running a node, so he doesn't have a say. Yeah, but he could trivially be running a node within hours. And so I think that the conversations around who's running a node, who isn't, which ones matter, which don't, I think it is all just dancing around the fact that Bitcoin's decentralized because anyone can run a node, and that the economic weight doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're actually verifying their own transactions or not. It's kind of more abstract than that.
Yeah, going back to some of the just like those fundamentals, like running a full node. Here he says, by which I mean nodes that store and validate the whole blockchain. And I actually think that's an improper definition, which is part of the issue here. It's like there's not actually a need to store the whole blockchain. A full node is merely one that has validated the whole blockchain, because you can have pruned nodes. And you could even have a pruned node that's pruned so much that it literally just kind of keeps the UTXO set and deletes everything else. But typically pruned nodes keep a little bit more data, including ones for particular wallets that are keeping track of particular histories for them. But the fullness of the full node has everything to do specifically with that validation. And like you said, there is no Bitcoin network outside of the Bitcoin nodes. That is the network itself. So I think of it as people's interface to the network. It's sort of an instantiation of a particular person's view of what Bitcoin is. And they're either using their own node or they're using someone else's node, and they want to, just go along with what that person views. But they're not tied to those people either. So, someone might be using Coinbase, and that's effectively when they go onto Coinbase and see their balance, they're basically using Coinbase's node in order to do so. But if they're doing any kind of trade beyond that, it's like they can query other nodes as well, including their own. I guess with Coinbase, you don't know which UTXOs belong to you, because I don't believe they structure deposits in that way. Other companies, have the option to structure UTXOs for their customers in that way, but a node is how you actually know anything about the relationship between you and the network. And yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, and basically all of it. But I would, for my kind of like broad view of nodes, I wrote an article that I later republished on the Nakamoto Institute called "Toward a Node World Order," in which I got into sort of the importance of node, what nodes do, and also being able to think about things from that sort of methodological individualist view of nodes, because I think part of what is being responded to here is this idea where you're saying like most nodes are dead weight. There was this belief, and I think it still exists among some people. I don't know if it's as broad as it used to be. They kind of but there used to be this belief that simply the number of nodes is what matters. So it's like, I'm running 20 nodes on AWS, therefore I have control of Bitcoin because, I'm relaying the blocks and everything. But it's like, my own my own node is validating everything. So you can't really lie to me, because as long as you could be trying to engage in some Eclipse attack or a Sybil attack on me where you're trying to give my node a false impression of the network. But if I have a single connection outside of that eclipse, then the proof of work gets everything I need to know around it. And so it simply doesn't work. And that's part of the beauty of its decentralization. And so just simply running a lot of nodes doesn't really matter. What matters is, like, it actually does go back to the people who actually have Bitcoin or believe they have Bitcoin, wielding nodes as a means to engage with the network in relation to that. If that makes sense. So, yeah, I do want to point out that here, I think that's really what, like, a lot of this was an actual belief that people held, was that simply running a bunch of nodes mattered. But I agree that this idea of economic full nodes that people talk about, which I do still see, is a little bit misleading, because of the fact that it's not getting to that sort of methodological individualism of how actors are working with the network. Because, like you said, you can be the lowliest person, and if you have your own node, you have staked your ground on a particular set of rules that you've defined as the Bitcoin rules. And if someone is trying to engage with trade with you and doesn't follow those rules, it doesn't matter what kind of economic power they have, your node just doesn't accept it. Now, this could mean, it's possible that people choose arbitrary rules that do not conform with other people. And the argument there is, you still have your own little, like, kind of a Bitcoin network, but in a sense, you're not part of the broader network, because your version of the network has much less marketability. And obviously money is all about the most marketable goods. So you have incentive to run a node that has a very marketable protocol rules, and not just simply arbitrary based on, kind of something you want versus what the network as a whole wants, which in some sense this article actually agrees with.
Yep.
So I am going to jump into the footnote from the end of that, and then we'll finish up this section. But I have learned that Amin Gun Sayer has expressed a similar idea in a blog post. However, he argues that it is the users who control Bitcoin, having one vote per node. When I originally wrote this article, I didn't deal with this case extensively because I didn't realize anyone was taking that position. So I'm dealing with the full nodes in this note now. Strap in, Pierre.
Yeah.
Consider the following thought experiment. Suppose, as again, that there were two forks of Bitcoin, new and classic. Suppose that new was preferred by investors and classic was preferred by people who run full nodes. And this is one of those places where it's like, okay, let's for the sake of argument, let's separate these out. But I would also like to say why that might be a little silly. As the two classes of people express their preferences and their actions, the investors would tend to cause an increase in the market cap of new over classic, while the node runners would tend to increase the number of nodes of classic over new. What has each class gained by this? The investors have gained an asset capable of producing a greater financial impact on the world than that of their competitors, and therefore more capable of attracting business. While the nodes do control a network in a sense, the investors control which network becomes important. Over a sufficiently long time span, therefore, the interest of those who now run full nodes become meaningless in comparison to the desires of those who are now investors. There are many reasons to run a node, and consequently, the class of people who run full nodes is less capable of maintaining a consistent set of interests or a group identity. The investors can, and their actions can be expected to alter the composition of the group of full node runners in a way that is not matched by the effect which the full node runners have on the investors. Consequently, an individual person's control over Bitcoin is better characterized in terms of the amount he owns than in the how many nodes he runs. This is why I say your control over Bitcoin is proportional to how much you own, and why I say that it is the investors, not the network nodes who control Bitcoin. And once again, it's like, so I think a big issue here is that there's an assumption about hard forks being a potential avenue for upgrading in general, which I sort of disagree with, because I think that the backwards incompatibility issue will almost always be a detriment to that network. But in a sense, yes, like the investors then, they do get to decide, which nodes are marketable, using a marketable set of protocol rules. But the belief that there would be high marketability in a new Bitcoin is a bit more fanciful to me.
Yeah, I think that there's network effects in liquidity, and when you do a hard fork, unless it's existential, and so the old chain dies because it had a fatal flaw in it, or a bomb in it, as might be the case, that the liquidity network continues to chug along with the old chain, and the new chain is starting with a liquidity of 0. Although you could argue it's greater than 0 just because of the UTXO set being copy pasted, and so maybe but as we read in previous articles about altcoins, if you have an imbalance in liquidity between coin A and coin B, and coin A has a slight edge, that compounds over time, and coin A dominates to 99% of the liquidity, and so the investors have a really limited impact because they can't change what I just said. So even if they want more liquidity to be on the new chain, they can't. It's wishful thinking to think that they can bootstrap that and make that happen.
Right. It can't just be a small group of investors. This would have to be investors, as in everyone who holds Bitcoin, which is a bit of a different thing. In that point, like I don't even know that investors is a bit of a funny term there.
Not only everybody who holds Bitcoin, but everybody who could potentially hold Bitcoin. The new buyers.
Right.
Which, if Bitcoin's a proper Ponzi scheme, you need those coming in.
That's an interesting thing, because what we're witnessing right now is a greater amount of, call it like fiat financial power, fighting over effectively like a smaller amount of new sats. But of course, they can buy off sats from others as well. But in order for Bitcoin to continue to grow, which I think made a great case as to why you would expect that to happen, it does actually require that more fiat money is going into it, which is part of why people kind of mistake it as a Ponzi. That's, part of the confusion. But, it does actually require more financial power for it to actually go up. And with that in mind, their perception of Bitcoin really does matter. And to me, I mean, that's part of why backwards incompatibility is a big detriment. Is those people, they want to do due diligence, and if they're being won over to the idea that Bitcoin is good for savings over the next 100 years or whatever, well, they need a coin that can actually demonstrate that. And any Bitcoin new has sort of inherently countered that claim, because it's made it clear that along the lines there was some instance where social norms or political ideas were able to overcome just sort of the raw economics of the thing. And it kind of, like I said, it sort of betrays the apolitical, raw economic nature of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and it resets the Lindy effect, right? So if you're a new investor coming into the market and you see that, the old coin has a price chart that goes back to 2009, this new coin started 2 days ago, It's like, okay, why would I put capital into the thing that is basically brand new? And they're selling it to me and saying, oh, we added a feature to it. It's like, okay, well, I'm here for long-term savings. So the decision is quite obvious that you're going to go with the one that's Lindy.
Yes, so it may unfortunately cause people to not invest at all. They might see it as like, oh well, there's the idea is that Bitcoin just can be copied over and over, and so altcoins get seen as a sort of diminishing of the value of the network. Forks would have the same effect as well, and so there could be people who view these things happening and decide I just don't want to invest at all because the whole class of what we call cryptocurrency doesn't appeal to my needs. But you'd have that, or someone who goes with the Lindy one and realizes like, oh, when we talk about cryptocurrency, what matters is Bitcoin, and everything else doesn't really matter. But with that, it's much harder to imagine the Bitcoin new being the one that now, without any kind of Lindy effect, is able to command the investments of people who have been waiting 15 years to get in on Bitcoin, as it were. It's been this hard. It's taken this kind of Lindy effect to get them into Bitcoin. The fork that just came out 2 days ago, is unlikely to be able to be the thing that wins them over now. You're probably at best going to have to wait another 15 years to see, okay, like this one has now done as much as Bitcoin and also better. But that also takes actual time and growth to happen, and not just by the whims of the people who wanted to have some new feature.
Yeah.
Continuing on from there, what about the miners? If they refuse to mine on the new chain, that will stop Bitcoin in its tracks, right? Well, no. Miners are in it for the money too. And if Bitcoin Classic cannot support the same hash rates as Bitcoin New, then they put more resources into mining Bitcoin New. Thus, miners also do not necessarily have much of a say in the matter either. It all boils down to the value of the two coins. If Bitcoin New becomes more valuable than Bitcoin Classic, then miners will mine it and services will support it. If not, then it won't. Investors settle the question. A Bitcoin investor can sell his Bitcoin New for Bitcoin Classic or vice versa, depending on which he thinks is the better idea. In both the cases of the service providers and the miners, the problem which makes them less influential than one might think is the fact that they do not necessarily have the funds to take the risk of deciding for themselves which version they like better and which they are going to promote. In short, the problem is that they are not necessarily investors, but by definition do have the funds. Investors do not have to listen to anybody else because they can afford to take the risk of asserting influence. Thus, it is the investors who control Bitcoin. And I think our argument is, in some sense, it's like in agreement with this. However, it's pointing much more to the negative in terms of whether such a thing would occur. Basically, it comes down to that. If not, then it won't. I think is sort of the key thing there.
Yeah.
Flowing uphill. Actually, I mean, did you have anything more on the miners? Because this, I don't see it as much in Bitcoin today, but I think at the time this was also a major confusion, and also one that continued on into some of the forks and everything. There's this emphasis on miners as controlling the network and viewing them as a minor, basically a sort of minor democracy, where you have shares based on kind of your hash power, and that gives you like how much kind of voting power over the truth of the network. But in reality, no amount of mining power can force any given node to accept a block if it disagrees with what that node believes a valid block is. And so miners are their profitability is downstream of what nodes what blocks they can actually get, and then what block rewards actually have any economic value that's going to help them pay the bills.
Yes, and we also can look at the block size wars, where they were basically saying, oh, we're going to take 90% of the hash rate and we're going to stop mining on this chain and we're going to start mining on a new chain. And they kind of have the labor theory of value of like, oh, well, with our hash rate, we're imbuing value onto this other alternative chain. But the reality is that if you just take 90% of the hash rate away from a chain, what happens is that the blocks take longer, right, to appear to be proposed. And the transactions, they pile up in the mempool. They start bidding against each other. They start bidding up the transaction fees. And so the economic reward of mining on that chain increases. And that it's not like they have this fantasy that because we've disrupted the timing between blocks, that's going to cause the value of Bitcoin to collapse, right? That if transactions take longer to confirm than people expect, then they're going to panic sell their Bitcoin and they're going to go, onto the new chain. And it's just fanciful thinking, because one, there's already built-in variance to the block confirmation. So you'll occasionally see people tweet out, oh, there hasn't been a block in more than an hour. And you'll see noobs be like, oh, is there a problem? It's like, no, it's just statistical variance. It's totally normal for there to not be a block in longer than an hour. And so pile on top of that most holders are not keeping an eye on the chain to make sure that there's a block every 10 minutes on average, right? So you can close your node. Your Bitcoin can be in cold storage. You can walk away for 5 years, for 10 years, for 15 years, and then come back. And Bitcoin doesn't have that requirement of you being online monitoring things. And so it's not like the holders would panic sell because they might not even be aware that 90% of the hash rate has gone away. And Bitcoin's assurances do not depend on that. And so, yeah, the idea that miners can somehow... Now, I think that the problem is that historically, Bitcoin mining hash rate has been used as a proxy to measure the overall acceptance of a soft fork by the Bitcoin network. And so I think that the miners signaling for soft forks has caused some confusion of saying, well, this signaling means that they're voting for it, which I think is a misreading of what the signaling is doing. And so the other challenge is that the signaling actually does have a practical impact, in that if you don't have hash rate behind a soft fork, that can be a problem, right? Where you could have your soft fork transactions become undone by insufficient miner acceptance of that soft fork. But that's for the early adopters of the soft fork to worry about. I think that that's not really relevant to the mass of Bitcoin users.
Yeah, I like to say that a watched block doesn't mine or get mined, like a watched pot. It's always, if you're trying to do something, that's always when you end up waiting for like 40 minutes to get a block. But yes, what do you think that the signaling is doing with regards to a soft fork?
I think it's a safety feature that basically, okay, now you can actually send transactions and receive transactions that use this soft fork feature, and you're de-risking the possibility of miners not mining it, or essentially reorging it out in the future because you didn't have enough hash rate for it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I don't think I said this earlier, and I sort of meant to, a description of soft forks. You can still operate with it, and some things might look funny. An example of this is with SegWit. If you have a node that does not recognize SegWit, the transactions happening on the network seem very funny, because they effectively have what looks like an anyone can pay nature to it, meaning anyone can lay claim to those coins. However, if you tried to lay claim to them yourself, you would find that those transactions just would never actually get validated, and no one would accept them because you don't have the signatures that they're actually looking for. And so, within a scenario where you have old node software, all of your funds are safe, but there might be things like this where you try to take a new action and it just doesn't go through. And that raises some questions for you of like, hey, is there something I should go learn about the world that I didn't know before that will help me make economic actions that I would like to take, or find out that certain economic actions are no longer possible? That is, they've been sort of soft forked away. That's different in the sense that you're still operating off proof of work and your way of doing things still works, but the political or social part is once again, it's like it's still opt-in, and you can decide to what degree. You can even, you can get a SegWit full node and still be like, I'm using the old style addresses because I don't want to. People are doing all these funny things now, but I don't want to encumber my own money within that structure. And you are free to do that.
Yep.
Continuing on, flowing uphill. Clearly, there are technical issues with the problem of creating a viable Bitcoin fork that I didn't go into. For example, a Bitcoin fork might not be able to work because its hash rate would initially be so low that blocks could take days or weeks to mine. Since there has never been a battle between two forks before, there are a lot of unknowns about how to do it right. But technical issues like that could be addressed if they were properly researched. Since then, we have had forks, and I think we've at least learned how not to do it. Like you said, these so-called bombs. The real issue is not precisely how a Bitcoin fork could actually be implemented, but merely the understanding of how events would play out in such a situation. Hypothetical situations affect reality today. When two armies meet, if they can determine who would win without actually fighting one another, then the battle is over without having begun. This is a similar situation. If a Bitcoin upgrade were known to be unpopular to investors, then its proponents, knowing who would win if push came to shove, would tend to back down before causing that much disruption. Thus, the investors are still in control even for real-life Bitcoin upgrades that never reach the point of creating such contention. And I think this is actually SegWit 2x, I think, is a great example of that, because there were futures markets and SegWit 2x was just getting so defeated in the futures markets that I think that played a large role in the decision to not go through with the fork in the first place. And thankfully too, because as a reminder, the fork itself of SegWit 2x had a one-off bug. So it would have been a disaster if everyone actually had upgraded.
Yeah, that's right. So it's definitely, the developers can think that they're in control, but all it takes is one bug to thwart their plans.
Yeah, so I'll put a link to the episode of Noted that you and I did around that time, going through Jimmy Song's episode. Jimmy Song's write-up about the 2x bug.
Great job, Jeff Garzik. Great job.
Yes. So, yeah, I think this is something that the market has played out in this way before. And we have not seen a case to the contrary. So it's possible that things could happen in a way that we wouldn't quite foresee. But that has not happened. And I think we've given some reasons why we wouldn't expect it to happen. But of course, lots of things can happen. What are the implications of this conclusion? The motivation of investors is the value of the coin. The general rule about Bitcoin upgrades, therefore, is that upgrades which increase Bitcoin's value will be adopted, and those which do not will not. Therefore, Bitcoin is not likely to be upgraded in ways which make it easier to regulate, because that would decrease the value of the coins. Bitcoin might be upgraded in ways that make it more anonymous, because a more anonymous coin would likely be more valuable. An upgrade which allows for larger block sizes is also likely to be adopted because the current limit of 1 megabyte will eventually limit Bitcoin's value as a form of money. Obvious bug fixes are likely to be adopted, whereas cockamamie schemes which do not clearly improve Bitcoin's values, such as proof-of-stake mining or changing the block reward schedule, have no real chance of succeeding and are therefore hardly worth talking about. And technically, we did see a growth of the block size, but that was almost like the least interesting thing about SegWit, and I think in hindsight actually a rather contentious part of it because of its effects later on, what it unlocked for Taproot to be able to do. So I think, well, let's read this last one, and then there's some other thoughts here. So last paragraph. This is not to say that Bitcoin is a divine substance or some immaculate bit of quintessence. It just means that Bitcoin upgrades must be a clear improvement to Bitcoin as an investment, or else they face a sharp uphill battle to adoption. Any scheme to reprogram it in service of special interests would almost certainly reduce its value proposition because it would change Bitcoin from something good for the world to something good for a smaller group. Of course, people actually need to be paying attention in order to prevent it, but we also don't need to go mad with hypervigilance. So, in many ways, I agree with this article, and I think the places where I don't think it holds up is that since then we have a clearer distinction between things like hard forks and soft forks, which changes completely kind of the nature of upgrades that we would generally be willing to adopt. That is, like we were saying earlier, a hard fork, I think in existential situations, and we can talk about that a little bit, would kind of make sense. But other than that, the only types of upgrades that I think people would be willing to take on, because it does not reset everything onto a new coin and repudiate everything that's happened so far and just create a new thing with, just with the same starting UTXO set. That just I see that as pie in the sky, and it's not something that people are going to do. And so hard forks are taken as the default in this article, I think, especially based on the time period. I think also just Daniel's personal beliefs on this matter. But I think since then we've learned that hard forks are not quite what Bitcoiners want, because backwards compatibility is such a vital component to the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, and what also gives us more certainty about its long-term savings potential. And the other major thing that I think we have learned since is how to think a little more clearly about the nature of a full node, why we run full nodes, what our relationship to it is, and so on and so forth, such that node operation is not merely a service provider, because that almost makes it seem like it's totally distinct from investors, when actually it's this vital thing where it's like every investor is tied to a node in some way, and it is their expression of what Bitcoin is. But ultimately, investors, the people who are actually holding keys, or have a relationship with a custodian that holds keys on their behalf, they are the ones who actually set the marketability of any given network protocol, such that they do ultimately kind of have the cards, so to speak.
Yep.
So I disagree that this should be taken off the Nakamoto Institute, but this is certainly an article that I think could use a major upgrade in and of itself. I think it would improve the value of the communication of the ideas of how investors are kind of at the forefront. On the existential one, here's what I think about the existential threat is, earlier in this, he said, and I agree with this, you could technically just, run both nodes. And the way that I imagine an existential threat is for a lot of those. So for any existential threat that you can see coming. So for instance, there's a Unix timestamp issue that will have to be addressed. You could theoretically make a fork right now and have that code available and have, I forget exactly how long we have. I believe, is it 2040? Do you know?
Hold on. No, I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
In any case, I think there's at least 15 years, if not more, before such a thing could occur, and it might even be much later than that. I forget the date. The point is it's not tomorrow, and having a fork, it's you could have a patch that is an extremely small change that focuses specifically on that, so highly targeted patch to the code, and you can always have that side by side. And in that time period, there's a lot of time to educate people about what's going to happen so that they're prepared for a potential situation. You have a lot of time to set up an additional node that runs that so that you are prepared in such a situation. And you also have time where it could be the case that someone figures out, like Luke did with SegWit, where, if we want this, we don't even have to do a hard fork. We can actually do a much more an actually backwards compatible way of implementing a fix. And maybe that's just something that we don't know how to do yet. It may be possible that there is no solution of the sort. But by leaving it open in that way, to the actual point that it causes known problems, you can be open to having a soft fork version of it. And by doing that, you've already created a sort of Lindy effect, or rather a shelling point around the effectively new coin before it's happened. And upon that date, when the thing actually happens, you would be able to, by virtue of running the nodes, you'd be able to actually see for yourself that one of the networks is not going and one of them has a continuation. And it would be up to every individual to decide how long it is before they want to kind of have chosen a winner, but they would be able to do so. So I think in the case of a known issue like that, there are ways that you could do it in a reasonable manner over a very long time period. But I think all of that goes to show how difficult it is to come up with this kind of new thing. There are other issues you can imagine. I guess quantum is something that people worry about. And if there was not just quantum, but a bug in the cryptography itself, obviously these things could also bring the network to a complete halt. I do think the reality, if such a thing happened, you would be instantiating basically a new Bitcoin network. But depending on how targeted it is and how it's gone about, you have a much greater likelihood of actually getting things rebootstrapped, as opposed to just in the middle of the, just for the heck of it, hey, I made this new feature, let's go add it to Bitcoin.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Any additional thoughts? Any disagreements with anything I said?
No. I think that I agree. We don't need to delete the article. I have a very poor reaction when people talk down running a node.
I do too. And this is actually why I gave that whole long spiel at the beginning, because I just wanted to, when I was rereading this beforehand, I was just kind of, I had that a bit of a wince, a cringe as I saw that, but I did want to think through that a little deeper than just at its surface level. But thankfully, I think I did a good job with my Node World Order article, kind of walking through some of the node stuff. So I'll be sure to leave a link to that as well in the show notes, so that people can go read that on the Nakamoto Institute and get a fuller expression of what I think nodes are all about from me, and more recently.
Maybe replace this one in the crash course with yours.
Not a bad idea. It doesn't. I don't know if it goes as much into forks, but that's also something we can think about.
Oh, there's my governance piece.
Yes, that is a good point. So perhaps that's due for some updating. This is also a great call. A lot of this, showing where things don't communicate as well, even in cases where they're right, don't communicate as well 10 years on, is a great way for us to reflect as educators of what needs to be restated. You actually, once things have been stated, not everyone has always written the ultimate Lindy thing that'll stand the test of time. So it's always a call for us to sharpen our communication of these ideas. So, for that, I'm very thankful for this, to remind us that there's always so much more work to do.
Yeah, and I feel like something that maybe 10 years ago, it's like, okay, that sounds right. And then 10 years later, we realize if you continue down that line of thought, then you're going to reach this wildly wrong conclusion. And so, even the beginning of that path, it needs to be corrected.
Yes, I agree with that. And, this mempool crash course, I think I first put it together in 2015. So with only one edition later on in 2016 when the blockchain technology article was written. So this itself, the crash course itself, is sort of predates the block size wars, so to speak. So, perhaps it's due for a very large upgrade and one that helps. Now, something that I think is so important from this last paragraph, all of this stuff always comes back to Henry Hazlitt's One Lesson in Economics, a book that I recommend to anyone. His One Lesson in Economics, which is sort of derived from Frederick Bastiat's idea of the seen and the unseen. He says, the whole of economics can be reduced to a single lesson, and that lesson can be reduced to a single sentence. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. And I think this is also important with kind of having a humility towards things that we wish to happen in Bitcoin, because anything that we wish for it, even when we have a desire to be doing something for the great good of all Bitcoiners for all time, our belief about that might not actually hold up in the marketplace. And so there's always a humility needed. And I think that's even more so when you're trying to make some kind of update to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin as it is, it's already standing the test of time, and it's sort of getting battle hardened every day. So there's a little more assurance with what it is. Now there might be limits. So he says, the 1 megabyte, might have a limit. And in some sense, yes, if you have an economic system that is just Bitcoin and it didn't have the capacity for things like Lightning, the way the full impact of Bitcoin would be different from one that perhaps had some other feature. But of course, the consequences of, say, removing a block size limit is so great that it doesn't matter, and actually you're better off only having that limited thing. Now, at the same time, we are very lucky because we also have a Bitcoin network that can scale in layers, and so we have that to work with as well, which is also something that we have to keep in mind is, perhaps someone will come up with something even despite the limitations that we are at present frustrated by. And so, yeah, there's great humility needed with regards to how you view Bitcoin to make sure that you really are thinking about Bitcoin for all people, for all time, and not merely something that suits your fancy or your what you want out of it. And that can be tough. All of us, all of us obviously have our self-interests, and that's a good thing. That's part of what makes Bitcoin work, because the market runs off self-interested people working together in a sort of market harmony. But just a good lesson there.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Pierre, for joining me, and thank you for pointing out some of the larger kind of issues to be worked out in this. And this is a good illustration of why it's good to revisit ideas after a while and see what holds up, what doesn't, and see how you can move forward.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.